The Ramada Lounge covered one large corner of the hotel's soaring glass atrium. By 6, its chrome bar was crowded with well-dressed lobbyists trolling for attractive secretaries from the agencies, and most of the tables were taken. The Florida legislature was in session 5 blocks away at the Capitol, and all the downtown lounges were busy with important people talking politics and angling for money and sex. Lacey entered, got her share of looks from the male crowd, and walked toward the right rear where she found Margie alone at a small table in a corner with a glass of water in front of her. "Thanks for coming," she said as Lacey took a seat. "Sure. You know this place?" "No. First time. Pretty popular." "Huh. This time of the year, yes. Things settle down when the carnival is over." "The carnival, the legislative session, January through March. Lock the liquor cabinet, hide the women and children. You know the routine." "I'm sorry. I take it you don't live here." "No, I don't." A harried waitress rushed to a stop and asked if they wanted something to drink as she frowned at the glass of water. Her message was pretty clear. "Hey gals, we're busy and I can give your table to somebody who'll pay for booze." "A glass of Pinot Grigio," Lacey said. "Same," Margie quickly agreed, and the waitress was gone. Lacey glanced right and left to make sure whatever they said could not be overheard. It could not. The tables were spaced far enough apart, and a steady roar emanated from the bar and drowned out everything else. Lacey said, "Okay, so you don't live here and I don't know your real name. I'd say we're off to a slow start, which I'm accustomed to. However, as I think I told you, I waste a lot of time with people who contact me then clam up when it's time to tell their stories. What would you like to know first? How about your name?" "I can do that." "Great. But I'd like to know what you'll do with my name. Do you open a file? Is it a digital file or an old-fashioned pen on paper file? If it's digital, where is it stored? Who else will know my name?" Lacey swallowed hard and studied her eyes. Margie could not hold the stare and glanced away. Lacey asked, "You're nervous and act as though you're being followed." "I'm not being followed, Lacey, but everything leaves a trail. A trail for someone else to follow. Is this someone the judge you suspect of murder? Help me here, Margie. Give me something. Everything leaves a trail." "You've said that." The waitress hustled by, pausing just long enough to set down 2 glasses of wine and a bowl of nuts. Margie appeared not to notice the wine, but Lacey took a sip. She said, "So, we're still stuck on the name thing. I'll write it down somewhere and keep it off our network, initially." Margie nodded and became someone else. Jerry Crosby, age 46, professor of political science at the University of South Alabama in Mobile. 1 marriage, 1 divorce, 1 child, a daughter. "Thank you. And you believe your father was murdered by a judge who's now on the bench?" "Correct. Yes, a Florida judge. That narrows it down to about 1,000. A circuit judge in the 22nd district. Impressive. Now we're down to about 40. When do I get the name of your suspect?" "Real soon. Can we slow down a bit? Right now it doesn't take much to rattle me. You haven't touched your wine. It might help." Jerry took a sip and a deep breath and said, "I'm guessing you're around 40 years old." "Almost. 39, so I'll turn 40 soon enough." "Traumatic." "Well, sort of, I guess. But life goes on." "So, 22 years ago you were still in high school." "Right, I suppose. Why is this relevant?" "Relax, Lacey, I'm talking now, okay? We're getting somewhere. You were just a kid and you probably never read about the murder of Brian Burke, a retired professor of law." "Never heard of it. Your father?" "Yes. I'm sorry. Thanks. For almost 30 years my father taught at Stetson Law School in Gulfport, Florida. In the Tampa area. I'm familiar with the school. He retired at the age of 60, for family reasons, and returned to his hometown in South Carolina. I have a thorough file on my father which I'll give you at some point. He was quite a man. Needless to say, his murder rocked our world and, frankly, I'm still reeling. Losing a parent too young is bad enough, but when it's murder, and an unsolved murder, it's even more devastating. 22 years later the case is even colder and the police have all but given up. Once we realized that they were getting nowhere, I vowed to try everything to find his killer. The police gave up. She drank some wine. Over time, yes, the file is still open and I talk to them occasionally. I'm not knocking the cops, you understand. They did the best they could under the circumstances, but it was a perfect murder. All of the mayor. Lacey drank some wine. A perfect murder, yes. No witnesses, no forensics, or at least none that can be traced to the killer. No apparent motive, Lacey almost asked. And so what am I supposed to do? But she took another sip and said, I'm not sure the Board on Judicial Conduct is equipped to investigate an old murder case in South Carolina. I'm not asking for that. Your jurisdiction is over Florida judges who might be involved in wrongdoing, right? Right. And that includes murder, I suppose, but we've never been involved in that. That's heavier work for the state boys, maybe the FBI. The state boys have tried. The FBI has no interest for two reasons. First, there is no federal issue. Second, there is no evidence linking the murders, thus the FBI doesn't know, no one knows but me I guess, that we're dealing with a potential serial killer. You've contacted the FBI years ago, as the family of the victim were desperate for help. Got nowhere. Lacey drank some more wine. Okay, you're making me nervous, so let's walk through this real slow. You believe a sitting judge murdered your father 22 years ago. Was that judge on the bench when the murder occurred? No, he was elected in 2004. Lacey absorbed this and looked around. What appeared to be a lobbyist was now sitting at the next table, gawking at her with a sort of leering vulgarity that was not uncommon around the Capitol. She glared at him until he looked away, then leaned in closer. I'd feel more comfortable if we could talk somewhere else. This place is getting crowded. Jerry said, I have a small conference room on the first floor. I promise it's safe and secure. If I try to assault you, you can scream and get away. I'm sure it's okay. Jerry paid for the wine and they left the bar in the atrium and rode the escalator up one flight to the business mezzanine, where Jerry unlocked a small conference room, one of many. On the table were several files. The women settled on opposite sides of the table, the files within reaching distance and nothing in front of them. No laptops, no legal pads. Both cell phones were still in their purses. Jerry was visibly more relaxed than in the bar, and began with, so, let's talk off the record, with no notes. None for now anyway. My father, Brian Burke, retired from Stetson in 1990. He taught there for almost 30 years and was a legend, a beloved professor. He and my mother decided to return home to Gaffney, South Carolina, the small town where they grew up. They had lots of family in the area and there's some land that had been handed down. They built this beautiful little cottage in the woods and planted a garden. My mother's mother lived on the property and they took care of her. All in all, it was a pleasant retirement. They were set financially, in pretty good health, active in a country church. Dad read a lot, wrote articles for legal magazines, kept up with old friends, made some new ones around town. Then, he was murdered. She reached to retrieve a file, a blue one, letter-sized, about an inch thick, same as the others. She slid it across the table as she said, "This is a collection of articles about my father, his career, and his death. Some dug up by hand, some pulled from the internet, but none of the file is stored online." Lacey didn't open the file. Jerry continued, "Behind the yellow tab there is a crime scene photo of my father. I've seen it several times and prefer not to see it again. Have a look." Lacey opened to the tab and frowned at the enlarged color photo. The deceased was lying in some weeds with a small rope around his neck, pulled tightly and cutting into his skin. The rope appeared to be nylon, blue in color, and stained with dried blood. At the back of the neck it was secured with a thick knot. Lacey closed the file and whispered, "I'm so sorry. It's weird. After 22 years, you learn to deal with the pain and place it in a box where it tends to stay if you work hard enough. But it's always easy to drop your guard and allow the memories to come back. Right now I'm okay, Lacey. Right now I'm real good because I'm talking to you and doing something about it. You have no idea how many hours I've spent pushing myself to get here. This is so hard, so terrifying. Perhaps if we talked about the crime." She took a deep breath. "Sure. Dad liked to take long walks through the woods behind his cottage. Mom often went along but she struggled with arthritis. One lovely spring morning in 1992 he kissed her goodbye, grabbed his walking stick, and headed down the trail. The autopsy revealed death by asphyxiation, but there was also a head wound. It wasn't hard to speculate that he encountered someone who hit him in the head, knocked him out, then finished him off with the nylon rope. He was dragged off the trail and left in a ravine, where they found him late in the afternoon. The crime scene revealed nothing. No blunt instrument, no shoe or boot prints, the ground was dry. No signs of a struggle, no stray hairs or fabrics left behind. Nothing. The rope has been analyzed by crime labs and gives no clue. There's a description of it in the file. The cottage isn't far from town but it's still somewhat isolated, and there were no witnesses, nothing out of the ordinary. No car or truck with out-of-state tags. No strangers lurking around. There are many different places to park and hide and sneak into the area, then leave without a trace. Nothing has come to the surface in 22 years, Lacey. It's a very cold case. We have accepted the harsh reality that the crime will never be solved. Yes, well, but it's more like a one cowboy rodeo. My mother died 2 years after my father. She never recovered and kinda went off the deep end. I have an older brother in California and he hung in for a few years before losing interest. He got tired of the police reporting no progress. We talk occasionally but rarely mention Dad. So, I'm in my own. It's lonely out here. Sounds awful. It also seems a long way from the crime scene in South Carolina to a courthouse in the Florida Panhandle. What's the connection? There's not much, honestly. Just a lot of speculation. You haven't come this far with nothing but speculation. What about motive? Motive is all I have. Do you plan to share it with me? Hang on, Lacey. You have no idea. I can't believe I'm sitting here accusing someone of murder, without proof. You're not accusing anyone, Jerry. You have a potential suspect, otherwise you wouldn't be here. You tell me his name and I tell no one. Not until you authorize it, okay? Understood. Yes. Now, back to motive. Motive has consumed me since the beginning. I've found no one in my father's world who disliked him. He was an academic who drew a nice salary and saved his money. He never invested in deals or land or anything like that. In fact, he was disdainful of developers and speculators. He had a couple of colleagues, other law professors, who lost money in the stock market and condos and other schemes, and he had little sympathy for them. He had no business interests, no partners, no joint ventures, stuff that generally creates conflict and enemies. He hated debt and paid his bills on time. He was faithful to his wife and family, as far as we knew. If you knew Brian Burke you would have found it impossible to believe that he would be unfaithful to his wife. He was treated fairly by his employers, Stetson, and admired by his students. 4 times in 30 years at Stetson he was voted outstanding professor of law. He routinely passed up a promotion to the dean's office because he considered teaching the highest calling and he wanted to be in the classroom. He wasn't perfect, Lacey, but he was pretty damn close to it. I wish I had known him. He was a charming, sweet man with no known enemies. It wasn't a robbery, because his wallet was in the house and nothing was missing from his body. It certainly wasn't an accident. So, the police have been baffled from the beginning. But, there could be more. It's a long shot but it's all I have. I'm thirsty. Lacey shook her head. Jerry walked to a credenza, poured ice water from a pitcher, and returned to her seat. She took a deep breath and continued. As I've said, my father loved the classroom. He loved to lecture. To him it was a performance, and he was the only actor on stage. He loved being in full command of his surroundings, his material, and, especially, his students. There's a room on the 2nd floor of the law school that was his domain for decades. There's a plaque there now and it's named for him. It's a mini lecture hall with 80 seats in a half moon, and every performance was sold out. His lectures on constitutional law were captivating, challenging, often funny. He had a great sense of humor. Every student wanted Professor Burke. He hated being called Dr. Burke, for constitutional law, and those who didn't make the cut often audited the class and sat through his lectures. It was not unusual for visiting professors, deans, alumni, and former students to squeeze in for a seat, often in folding chairs in the rear or down the aisles. The president of the university, himself a lawyer, was a frequent visitor. You get the picture. I do, and I can't imagine it. I can recall, with horror, my con law course. That seems to be the norm. The 80 students, all first year, who were lucky enough to get in, knew that he could be tough. He expected them to be prepared and ready to express themselves. Her eyes moistened again as she remembered her father. Lacey smiled and nodded and tried to encourage her. Dad loved to lecture, and he also loved the Socratic method of teaching, where he would select a student at random and ask him or her to brief a case for the benefit of the class. If the student made a mistake, or couldn't hold her ground, then the discussion often became contentious. Over the years I've talked to many of his former students, and while all still express admiration, they still shudder at the thought of trying to argue con law with Professor Burke. He was feared, but in the end greatly admired. And every former student was shocked by his murder. Who could possibly want to kill Professor Burke? You've talked to former students? Yes, under the guise of collecting anecdotes about my father for a possible book. I've been doing this for years. The book will never be written, but it's a great way to initiate a conversation. Just say you're working on a book and people start talking. I have at least 24 photographs sent by his former students. Dad at graduation. Dad drinking a beer at a student softball game. Dad on the bench during moot court. All little slices of college life. They loved him. I'm sure you have a file. Of course. Not here, but I'm happy to show it to you. Maybe later. We were talking about motive. Yes. Well, many years ago I was talking to a lawyer in Orlando who studied under my father, and he told me an interesting story. There was a kid in his class who was rank and file, nothing special. My father called on him in class one day to discuss a case involving the Fourth Amendment, searches and seizures. The kid was prepared but believed something contrary to what my father was saying, and so they had a pretty good row. My father loved it when students became passionate and fought back. But this student made some comments that were a bit extreme and out of line, and he was somewhat cocky in the way he bantered with Professor Burke, who managed to wrap things up with a laugh. The next class, the student probably figured that he was off the hook for a while, and came in unprepared. Dad called on him again. Trying to wing it was an unpardonable sin, and the student flamed out in a big way. 2 days later, Professor Burke called on this student for the third time. He was prepared and ready to fight. Back and forth they went as Dad slowly boxed him into a corner. It's not wise to argue with any professor who's taught the same material for years, but this guy was arrogant and sure of himself. The knockout punch was a one-liner that destroyed the student's position and brought down the house. He was humiliated and he totally lost it. He cursed, flung a notebook, snatched his backpack and stomped out of the classroom, the door almost shattering behind him. With perfect timing, my father said, "I'm not sure he's cut out for jury trials." The classroom exploded with laughter, so loud the student could not have missed it. He dropped the class and began a counterattack. He complained to the dean and the president. He considered himself a laughingstock and eventually withdrew from the law school. He wrote letters to alumni, politicians, other professors, some really bizarre behavior. He wrote letters to my father. They were remarkably well written but rambling and not really threatening. The last letter was sent from a private mental health facility near Fort Lauderdale and written in longhand on its stationery. In it he claimed to be suffering from a nervous breakdown caused entirely by my father. She paused and took a drink of water. Lacey waited, then said, "That's it. Motive is a disgruntled law student." "Yes, but it's far more complicated than that." "Let's hope so." "What happened to him?" "He got his head together and finished law school at Miami. Now he's a judge." "Look, I know you're skeptical, and with good reason, but he is the only possible suspect in the world." "Why is it more complicated?" Jerry took a long look at the files at the end of the table. There were 5 of them, all an inch thick, each a different color. Lacey followed her gaze, finally caught her drift, and asked, "And those are 5 more victims of the same killer?" "If I didn't think so I wouldn't be here. I'm sure there is a connection." "There are 2. One is the method. All 6 were hit in the head and then asphyxiated with the identical type of nylon rope. Each ligature was grated into the skin of the neck and tied off by the same knot and left behind, sort of like a calling card. And all 6 had a bad history with our judge. A bad history. He knew them well, and he stalked them for years." Lacey caught her breath, swallowed hard, and felt a clutching fear in her stomach. Her mouth was suddenly dry, but she managed to say, "Don't tell me his name. I'm not sure I'm ready for it." There was a long gap in the conversation as both women gazed at the walls. Lacey finally said, "Look, I've heard enough for one day. Let me stew on this and I'll give you a call." Jerry smiled and nodded and was suddenly subdued. They swapped phone numbers and said their goodbyes. Lacey hurried through the lobby and couldn't wait to get in her car.